Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations about art, literature, and creativity. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 134. Today's guest is Luther Hughes. Hey there, folks. Welcome to the show. Today's conversation is with poet Luther Hughes. Luther Hughes is the author of the debut poetry collection A Shiver in the Leaves, which was published in 2022 by BOA Editions, and the chapbook Touch, which was published in 2018 by sibling Rival Press and was recommended by the American Library Association. He is the founder of Shade Literary Arts, a literary organization for queer writers of color, and co-hosts the Poet Salon podcast. Recipient of the Ruth Lilly and Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Fellowship and 92Y Discovery Poetry Prize, his writing has been published in American Poetry Review, Paris Review, Orion, and more. He was born and raised in Seattle, where he currently lives. So I've been looking forward to A Shiver in the Leaves for months now, ever since I first saw Luther's announcement on Twitter. In fact, I've been a fan of Luther's since even before that, from his individual poems to his curated poetry newsletter, Lou's Poetry Hour, to the podcast that he co-hosts with Gabrielle Bates and Duji Dahat, the Poet Salon. And this debut collection of his is everything I'd hoped for. These poems are tender, erotic, vulnerable, at times dark, at times ecstatic. I loved it. A couple of things before we get started. Coming up on November 4th, 2022, Luther will be reading with Carl Phillips and Lynn Melnick at Brooklyn Poets. There's a link to the event page in the show notes. There are also links to purchase a copy of A Shiver in the Leaves from Open Books in Seattle, the Book Catapult here in San Diego, and from bookshop.com. And as always, I recommend ordering it from your own local independent bookstore. Finally, for subscribers to our Patreon, Luther has added a reading to the bonus audio archive of his poem, The River. That's available to patrons at the $2 per month level, and you can go to patreon.com/likewisemedia to sign up. Okay, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Luther Hughes. I just wanted to tell you, before I say anything else, that I've been such a big fan of your work. I was really looking forward to when this collection came out. I really loved it. I also have just greatly appreciated everything that you do, with your colleagues on the Poet Salon, as well as the first that I ever knew of you was when someone recommended Lou's Poetry Hour.
Oh, wow.
So I've been following your work in one way or another for a while now, but I'm so pleased to have gotten the chance to read your first collection here. It was really quite amazing. And I was hoping that we could start with a reading.
Yeah. Thank you for saying all that. I really appreciate that. As someone who just now has a book, I'm always curious at how people come across my work, but I guess I'm not surprised that people come across my work in the same way I come across others' work. So I don't know why that surprises me, but it's still surprising to learn.
Yeah.
I'm going to read a poem that I never actually read aloud, and I'm going to read it because of possibly the conversation today. The Fever.
Okay.
I came to steal the night. I came to steal the stars. I came to the bus stop as a breeze bowing. I came to praise the ecstasy of sound. Was the road clothed in the rain's sleek robe? Did the lilies finally loose themselves? Had the doves settled their romance with flurry and fire? Bestow upon me, O wise doves, a sublime motel bathroom. Bestow upon me your God, your supreme channel of milk. I can do this labor, this putting it into my mouth, taking it back out. I came into this world as an abused prayer. Bestow upon me the power and the glory. This night he gives to me his seed, and I came into my hunger. And shouldn't I swallow what's mine?
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is it's always interesting. I always ask my guests to pick what they're going to read when they're going to do a reading. And almost invariably, they pick one of the ones that really stood out to me when I was reading it myself. One of the things about this poem in particular, the erotic runs through this collection. It's a strong through line. Not every single poem, I guess, has the eroticism foregrounded, but many of them do, obviously. Mm-hmm. And here I feel like, actually, the first question that I kind of want to ask is what you just said. You never read this one aloud. And why is that?
Why is that? I think it's because, well, and I guess I don't read a lot aloud. I don't have a lot of readings. Or do a lot of readings. And so when I do readings, I want to read poems that have touched people in certain ways and elements, or I've learned to touch people. And so this poem in particular, while I think it's one of my favorite poems in the collection, I don't read aloud because I want it to be kind of like a nugget in the book where it's like fun to come across, because it's not a poem that has been widely shared, because I don't read it often. And so I don't read it often because I want it to be like a little something sweet in the book that people can come across or don't expect, at least.
I guess that makes sense. To me, this is one of the more, I don't know if explicit is quite the right word, but so many of the poems here are sexually charged, but this one in particular feels like it has an ecstatic quality that, again, that's not unique to this poem in this collection, but is so much more like foregrounded in this one than in many of the other poems. And I know that you have written, both in poetry and in essay, pretty extensively about eroticism and desire and what all of this stuff means. The thing that you had said before about not reading it very often, what it brought to mind was the essay that you wrote for Winter Tangerine for part of an essay series where you were writing. It was called On Power, where you were writing, a pretty explicit sex scene. And then later you talked about how writing that scene was uncomfortable. And then in a different essay on vulnerability, you talked about how there is something about being the one that takes your clothes off first that is both vulnerable, but also an act of power. And I feel like both of these things feel relevant here, but I don't know if I'm on the right track.
You are. Actually, it's funny that you mentioned that essay. That essay, and if I believe correctly, the scene is sex in the motel bathroom. The poem is the same scene, actually. And so it's funny that you mentioned those things because it's talking about the same scene. I just happen to be able to write it differently for different pieces. But I do think when it comes to the On Vulnerability essay and the essay on power and then this poem and this explicitness in talking about desire and sex and what does it mean to be vulnerable but also have power, I was reckoning with that for a long time, specifically by writing this book as well. Because I was so interested in the idea of what it meant to, one, be naked, because I also loved and kind of love still, I guess, to the day, to be naked. I also love to be all gold while naked. And I also, for being honest, have a high sex drive. And so because I know all these things and because I know I'm able to draw in men because of those things, I began wondering then why is it that the person penetrated seems to be always stereotyped as the one having less power. So it didn't make sense for me because of my own experience, because I felt like I was having all the control in the room. I was the one, I feel like, curating how people are going to approach me or talk to me or engage with me. I felt like I was controlling the motel bathroom scene, even though I was the one being penetrated. And so it's something that I still reckon with to this day about what does it mean to be vulnerable and how vulnerability does, in an essence, come with a sort of power. But I was enjoying the idea of being naked and being vulnerable, ensuing power.
It is something I feel like is explored a lot in these poems, this relationship between power and vulnerability, or between our perceptions of, what it means to bottom versus what is actually happening in the space between the two people who are involved in it. Another thing which feels related to me, and also this reminds me of later on in the collection, the poem Thine Will Be Done. Both of these poems are explicitly bringing God into the sexual moment here. Bestow upon me your God. Mm-hmm. I don't have the other one in front of me, but to me, like there's something, there's a bunch of things about that strike me as interesting, but in the context of vulnerability and power that we also have so often are told about this sort of relationship that we have with the Almighty. You know, mm-hmm. I'm not religious myself, but so much of what, you know, we're told about in religion is, you know, submitting. Mm. And I can't help wondering if this is connected here as well, you know?
Yeah, I would be lying if I said it's not connected. I grew up Baptist, so that is always going to be part of my understanding of the world and how I look at the world, whether consciously or unconsciously, is always going to be there. And so for sure, the idea of submitting to you know, a higher power, or the idea of God or godliness or even goodness, was going to be part of my journey of being a writer. It can't be separated, one, given because the Bible itself is literature. And so when you study literature, you study the Bible, when you think about these things in relation to your own life. And so in the book, now that you mentioned it, there are several poems, not just those two poems you mentioned, that bring in God, and that's the Christian God in particular, because the book is so concerned with this idea of submitting to something, whether that's to one's own idea of what it means to be loved, whether that's to a body, whether that's to Seattle, whether that's to the act of suicide. And so the idea of submitting is going to always be there because of my relationship with God and my upbringing with Christianity, and even my upbringing with my mother and my father, right? Like a child has to in some way submit to their parents because they're being told what to do and how to do things. And so I'm always in relationship with the idea of submitting throughout my life and throughout how I see the world, I think.
It's interesting because, you know, this poem in particular is taking an act that is so often associated with a submissive position, you know, the act of being penetrated, being something submissive, and yet turning that perception on its head and talking about how, you know, this act is as much or perhaps more for the speaker's pleasure as it is for the penetrator's pleasure, you know, that it is not merely that being penetrated is to be acted upon, but is also to act upon someone else. And taking that in a religious direction, like putting those next to each other, it just feels so, I don't know a better word to say than like sparky. Like it just makes my brain kind of light up, you know?
Yeah, yeah. It's funny because I agree. I think I have my own thinking, like bottoming, you know, for me, if I'm being honest, bottoming for me is pleasurable for me. I do it for myself. Like I don't, of course, you know, I have a boyfriend and I love giving him pleasure in certain ways. But up until then, I always thought of bottoming as pleasurable for me and not for the other person. And so if we're thinking about the idea of submitting to something and doing something in an act of one's own benefit, if we look at that from a Christian or like religious point of view, what does it mean for someone to practice religion because they love to practice religion versus having to practice religion because they're supposed to, given their faith and given their ideology? And so, and given that you think that who they're practicing it to deserves it and wants it. So what does it mean to kind of like tilt that perception and be like, you know what, I'm praising God because I love to praise God. Now I'm praising God because I'm supposed to, or he, you know, demands it of me. And so when I think of sexual acts, specifically in A Shiver in the Leaves, I'm thinking of it in a way where it's like, I'm doing these things for myself to get through something and not because the other person wants it from me.
It's hard with the way that religion inflects our culture of sexuality in the United States. And this is particularly true in evangelical churches, but not strictly, not solely in those churches, but how, and this is something that you've written about too, how at least in some Christian churches, the sexual act is something that is considered to be unclean or sinful, especially if it's not performed in like a very sort of strict set of parameters. And yet the ecstasy in this poem and in several of the other poems is so akin and so explicitly juxtaposed with religious ecstasy that I can't help feeling that here sex is treated as just the opposite, that it is treated as a site of the holy. And I wonder if that is what is that? Does that bring anything up for you?
Yeah. I think so. So I will say, yes, I think sex is an act of holiness, but I don't think of sex as sacred, if that makes sense. I think the idea of how sex is portrayed or whatever, is portrayed in some instances that sex has to be a special moment all the time, right? It's sacred. You have it when you're ready for it, X, Y, and Z. I don't think of sex as sacred. I think of it as holy in a sense that it does do something for the body and for the mind and for the spirit. And so for me, I enjoy sex. I've always is pushing it. Since I've been able to reclaim sex as something I love to do, I've always enjoyed it since the reclamation of sex. And so for me, engaging in it and doing it becomes holy for me because, again, it's an act of engaging my entire being. And not just my body, even though my body's engaged, but I become emotionally engaged. I become spiritually engaged, mentally engaged. And so for me, it becomes holy in that aspect. And again, that's sacred because, again, it's not, for me, sex is not something that has to be precious or, like a diamond and whatever. No, it's holy, but not sacred.
Yeah. My first impression, I've read through the book twice now, and I remember coming away from it the first time really being struck by how in these poems, so many things, but, sex, love, death, the city, or, extending that beyond the city to the world, the earth, the universe, how these things are all sort of held together in this very kind of tender way. And in a way where the erotic becomes not just something unto itself, right? Not just, it's not pornographic, right? But rather that the erotic opens something that allows us to understand all of these other things, perhaps in a different context and perhaps relating them together. One of the things I was sort of thinking about as I was doing researching and preparing to talk to you was thinking about, how the ancient Greeks had all these different words for different kinds of love. Obviously, we get the word erotic from eros, but then there's also agape, storge, philia, all of these different, love that you have for your parents, love that you have that's courtly love that you have for yourself or whatever, right? But I feel like there is something in this collection that is almost working against that understanding of love as being these separate things, where it's kind of collapsing all of them into where they're getting all tangled together, And in a lot of ways, I think this is sort of more like the way that I experience these things, Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. You're correct. The book for sure collapses the idea of love and loving different people, but in the same almost intense way. And I think it's because for me as a human being, that's kind of how love operates. I don't know if I'm able to understand loving myself if I don't understand how to love my mother and vice versa. I don't understand how to love, say, Seattle without understanding how to love, say, my friend. And so as human beings, I think, or I speak for myself, everything works together. Everything is in response to each other. Nothing is separate for me. Everything is always kind of woven and threaded, seamlessly or unseamlessly together, depending on the relationship or depending on the day or the time or the month or the year. But I can't see one thing without seeing the others. And this is why the book really speaks towards all of these different aspects of love, because I can't speak to just one part of love without the other parts.
I want to go back to something that you said just a few minutes ago about the poem, The Fever, and then that essay on power. Just because I'm always really curious, you said that the scene in both the essay and the poem are the same happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet, although I think that the poem and the essay they're not doing totally different things, but they are doing different things. And so I guess I wonder, like, for you, like, how, in approaching this same thing, or, how are you deciding what's going to be prose and what's going to be poetry? Or like, does one form or the other offer you as the writer a different experience of working through ideas or feelings or things like that? I know you've talked before, both in writing and like on your podcast before, about, poetry and writing being something that allows you as a person to work through things, But I'm kind of curious, like, how these different forms allow you as the writer and as a person to work through things differently. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. When it comes to prose, I'm still trying to understand prose for me. I don't really think I have a firm grasp of myself as a prose writer. And so the essays that I've written so far that have been published, and even like the one short story that I've got published years ago, those things kind of happened because I was wrestling with those topics a lot, and I couldn't find a way for poetry to contain my wrestling. And so I needed to kind of hash out my thoughts on those topics in a very, in a way where the essay is kind of structured. I think of essay writing as just literally just like a wandering around, like a walking around a field or something with thoughts in your mind. And so I needed to kind of do that on paper. And when I think of poetry, I go to poetry because I read poetry and go to poetry because I want to be like surprised or awed or be challenged to think of something in a new way. I don't think of writing prose that way. I think of prose as a way to just kind of meander and kind of almost kind of like bullshit myself. And poetry for me isn't a place for me to bullshit. It's a place for me to journey for sure. And it's similar in the same way of like meandering, but I think poetry for me is more of a space for me to kind of flourish and, use other elements of craft and kind of love on the elements of craft in ways that can get me to the same place as writing prose can, right? On Power and The Fever, like you were saying, like they approach the same topic in similar ways, but there are still very different pieces. And so both prose and poetry can get me to the same place or can get me thinking about the same thing. But The Fever restructures itself as a container for thinking about power and thinking about one's selfhood in the vein of talking about sound and imagery and repetition. On Power can't do what The Fever has done. On Power can't use sound and can't use, the metaphor and can't use certain elements to get to power. And so again, prose is still a mystery to me. I don't know if I will ever understand prose writing for me just because it's prose and I'm not really understanding how that works for people. But poetry I can understand and poetry I can work through. And so I think every prose that I have written, and if I continue to write prose, it's always going to have a meandering. Even if it's like a review on a book, even my book reviews that I've written, they still kind of meander. And so I don't know why that is. I just think I just have an issue with coming to a topic in prose and like focusing on that topic. I kind of have to write my way around the topic to get through it.
It's interesting because, for me, I write both poetry and prose, but I've always sort of thought of myself primarily as a prose writer, as an essayist. And I feel like my approach to these things is almost like the opposite of you.
Really?
Because to me, the experience of both reading and writing prose is so much more concrete for me and so much more sort of analytical that it doesn't, even when it meanders, if it's like meandering on purpose, where like with poetry, there's something sort of more intuitive and immediate about it. One of the things I was sort of thinking about this, I mean, just since we're on this topic, was in your poem, Obad, in here, how, you know, you've got these two stanzas and they're in different tenses, and how it's almost like the speaker of this poem is in the second stanza sort of being pulled out of a reverie, you know, and it feels very, there's a couple other poems that do something similar. I think Prayer does something similar, where to me, it feels more like the poem is doing something that is both immediate and like experiential in a way that prose feels more like explanatory, if that makes sense, you know? But that when I'm trying to understand, like that a poem makes me feel things, but but very often I don't know why it makes me feel certain things, you know? And so there's like this lack of understanding, or at least lack of understanding that I can articulate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think that's also, I think, why I love poetry too, is because you read something, you're like, I'm having a response to this, but I can't pinpoint where I am getting that response from. So in the poems you mentioned, and several other poems actually do the similar thing, where it kind of switches either like a scene, or like, it's like you're saying, being pulled from a moment into like sort of a reality. I do that, or I've done that before, kind of for myself. It's kind of a selfish move, actually, where I think I am focusing too much on one thing at one time. And so I'm like, Luther, come on, like, you got to switch gears here, because you're on this thing for so long and you have to like move past it. And so when I think of poetry and a response and wanting to be pulled out of, the poems that I tend to love the most are poems that I can't seem to leave. And so I think I'm talking in roundabouts here. And so it's something you're saying, like, for me, writing a poem, I love writing poems because I can lose myself in the poem. I can lose myself in the act of writing it, and both editing it and talking about a subject. And when I find myself writing poems like that, and the poems that I switch gears, it's because I'm telling myself to switch gears. It's a very, very selfish and very purposeful move. However, I hope in those gear switches that the reader is still able to keep the same emotional energy.
It's interesting that you'd call that a selfish move, because I feel like it is one, like I would have called it the opposite. I would have called it a generous move, because I feel like it puts the reader in a space with the speaker of the poem in a much more emotionally immediate way. But, you know, maybe that's just me.
No, I think you're right. I call it selfish because I did it for myself, but I can for sure understand it being also generous to the reader because of what you're saying. And a lot of the poems are written, I say selfishly because, again, I think being selfish means you're doing it from the perspective, you're doing it for the benefit of yourself. But I do think the poems are very, very generous in how subject matters are approached.
Yeah. I mean, coming back to the idea of vulnerability, there is so much that is, like, it's not shy. None of these poems are shy, right? They're putting a lot out there. I hesitate to say they're putting it all out there because, you know, there's, you know, what you're not, what you don't read is not going to necessarily be obvious to you, right? Like what's not included, but I mean, a lot is put out there and feels very transparent, both in terms of sort of like scene, but also, emotion. And it's an interesting thing because, so like in one of the interviews that you did, I think it was with Seattle Times, you talked about, you know, because some of these poems are pretty heavy, right? Whether they're dealing with suicidal ideation or whether they're dealing with police violence. And you talked about not wanting to re-trigger anybody. And not wanting to have people go through the process or have to have the process of going through rehashing somebody else's death. I guess I wonder, like, you know, for you as the poet, because many of these poems, well, really, I mean, all of the poems are very emotionally charged, but many of them are emotionally charged. They're emotionally intense in ways that I could imagine being sort of re-triggering for the poet to have to relive some of the emotions as you're writing them. Mm-hmm. And I know like this is a big topic that a lot of people talk about, is like, to what degree am I, especially as a marginalized person, expected to sort of perform my suffering and share these things with the audience. At the same time, I also know, and this is something you've talked about, that like the act of writing the poem can be healing, can be exploratory, can be something that is helpful to the poet. But like how that all balances out, you know, I'm curious, you know?
Yeah. The poems that deal specifically with actual deaths and that talk towards them, or even around them, through them, however you see it. So for me, I had a stint of really digging into researching and reading about a lot of these instances in ways that, looking back now, were not healthy, actually. But I was so curious, I think. I'm curious by nature. So I was just curious about how these things kept happening as frequently as they did. There was for sure like a stint in our history, American history, from 2012 to like 2020, honestly. It's like 8 years where it felt like a lot of Black people were dying back to back to back to back, which is still the case now. But it felt like, because of the heightened media around it, it felt like it was happening literally every like single day. And I was like, how is this possible? Like, where in anybody's mind are we not seeing the problem with this and need it to change systemically? But that wasn't happening. And so I was looking into a lot of Black death, a lot of just videos or clippings of like how this was happening. And at some point, it just became difficult. It really did become difficult. And so there wasn't really a way for me to exit that besides writing it. And I'll also add that writing these poems didn't necessarily heal the pain I sort of upon myself by researching it. I don't think for me particularly that all my writing becomes healing for me. It allows me to think through things, and by thinking through them, I'm able to then think about them differently after writing the poem. But for these poems in particular, in addition to why I didn't want to re-trigger somebody or myself, how I thought about these deaths in relation to myself and the body are very real accounts in the poem. So in particular, there's a poem in Seattle, which I think I mentioned this in interview, that in Seattle is about a person that I actually have known. And the reason why I didn't want to say how the person died was because I was still understanding what that meant for me in relation to walking through Seattle and seeing all these things and nobody else really being, in pain about this person dying besides myself. And so poems like that, poems like Dearest, which was about being Kaida, found hanged, like they're all real accounts of how I was feeling. And because of that, because I wanted to prioritize my thought process over the actual violence, I was then able to think differently about those violences and violences moving forward. I don't think I've written about probably a Black person dying since these poems, and I most likely won't ever again, because these poems help me to rethink about what it meant to engage in those incidents differently and what it meant to then write about them. And I told myself, and have, I think, come to the understanding that writing about these Black deaths for me doesn't heal me. And in fact, if I'm ever encouraged to write about these deaths, I'm going to then fall into the same thing in the same rabbit hole I've done with these poems. And I told myself to not do that ever again.
I guess, healing is maybe not the right word. I mean, even as I was sort of saying that, that didn't feel quite right. But I guess poetry need not be motivated by the personal, but it just seems like so often is, it seems like so often that poetry is motivated by some sort of preoccupation of the poets, whether that might be, an event in their life or in the world, or just something that they are wrapped up in. And as you say, that the act of writing can help clarify things for oneself. Like, how can you go through a period like we've been through, where, just like you were describing, it felt like one horrific event piled upon another before we'd even been done processing the previous one, and then another, and then another, and then another. It would be impossible to go through that and not have a certain sort of preoccupation with it, right? So even if it's not healing, then that at least there being some ability to move on, from being stuck in that moment. Does that make sense? Yeah, it does. I think, I want to also clarify, I think healing can be the right word for some people. And I can't imagine people reading those poems and feeling a little bit of closure. Not in the sense that, like, I'm over the death, but more like understanding a little more how they felt about the incident. And that can lead to healing. And so healing can be the right word depending on the person. But I think you're right. I think the idea of, I do think poets and writers in general do come to writing a piece from their own personhood, because we're humans, and, it's hard for us not to see the world through our own perception and through our own thoughts and ideas. And so even though the poem can be, super, scientific, or what the opposite of art is, but like other than art, or the opposite of emotion or whatever, the poet still came to the page thinking about these things from their own perspective. And even that perspective can be changed, shifted, and modulated based off of research. It's still from their own perspective. But yeah, I think, having always feeling like something's happening. Like you're saying, one horrific event after the next. And even, the pandemic, starting in 2020, it did feel like things were happening back to back to back to back still then too. And so I'm in awe of those who have been able to write about the quarantine so quickly, even having books about it already. I'm in awe of that, because for me, it takes me so long to begin thinking about incidents like that, and even to write it down in a way that is succinct and beneficial. I think for those who have done it, I think for them, writing it is an act of them healing, because I think they're going to it so quickly because they don't know how else to think about it in the moment. For me, the Trayvon Martin poem in particular, that poem is also in my chapbook Touched. But both of those poems, or Trayvon at least, wasn't written until years after the incident. And so it takes me so much time to really consider what I'm going through. And the issue, I think, for me is that, and why the poems feel so urgent, is because they're written in the process of trying to understand what's happening, or why I feel a certain way. And so I've been feeling those feelings for several years. And so it feels urgent because of that. So I think we're almost at the end of the first segment here, but I don't want to stop talking about this book without talking a little bit about crows. So
it's my life now. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I know everybody wants to probably talk about crows. It's such a strong recurring image throughout these poems that, I just feel like I can't not, but particularly, how, what I find interesting here is the first image that we get of crows is in the very first poem. And I feel like we all already have sort of a association, right? A sort of like what we think of as like the emotional register that we think of when we think of crows, because crows as a species, they're often scavengers. And in this first poem, we're given images of a crow as a scavenger with a rat hanging from its beak, also as scavenged, that it is one with its wings plucked empty. So these are creatures, and especially in the way that they're described, would, I think, for a lot of readers, evoke a certain sense of revulsion. And yet the speaker of this poem is moved to a feral yearning for love. I feel like the way that sort of dynamic works out throughout that, where the poems keep coming back to this image of crows, and yet it is one where we are sort of exhorted to see them differently. Does that make sense? To see them differently than the way that we're usually talking about crows, you know? And I find that so fascinating, especially because maybe this is just because I've been on TikTok so much lately, but like there's so many people that love crows on TikTok that as a bird, they're like one of the smartest ones. You can make friends with them. They become intensely loyal to the point where they'll even start attacking people that they think that are your enemies. And obviously, like any bird, they can fly. There's something to that. I mean, the images of flight come back, you know, throughout these poems as well. But this invitation to look at these creatures differently, I just feel like is such a, I don't know, it feels very vital to me throughout this. But I mean, obviously, there's a lot of things going on with crows here. So can we talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. So yes, like you're saying, people tend to love crows based off everything you're saying. Like they're smart. They feel close because they feel domesticated in certain ways. And so that it feels like a closeness to them. They're, as a species and like, as a community, they're one that can be studied holistically. They can be tamed to do anything. And so I think at large, people love crows because of those very like basic things that crows can do. I tend to love crows for those same reasons as well. And also just because, I mean, I've always been around crows. I think Seattle has one of the biggest crow populations, I think for sure in the country. I'm tempted to say the world, but that can't be the case. Sounds crazy to say and think about. And so I've always thought of crows as just something of home or something that reminds me of home. When I moved to other places, I didn't realize they didn't have crows in other places. And so I was just like, what is going on? Like, where are the crows at? Like, I'm seeing a crow here and there, but like, I'm not seeing like a murder of them, you know? And so like, what's that about? And so that then kind of increased my obsession with crows, given that, you know, I wasn't always around crows anymore, which then increased my obsession with the idea of home and what home meant to me, which then tied into Seattle. But for crows in particular, I think because crows in the book are tied to blackness, and not just, you know, racial blackness, but also blackness when it comes to the color, when it comes to a sort of like emptiness, when it comes to a sort of lack of color, when it comes to depression, when it comes to a sort of omen. And so for me, because blackness is tied to all those things in the book, it was important that crows kind of share different faces. One, because I've seen crows look differently from day to day and do different things from day to day besides just being scavengers. I've seen crows being attacked while also attacking. I've seen crows be intimate while also being distant. I've seen crows kind of like taunt and haunt you. I've been followed by crows before. I followed crows before. And so I've seen crows kind of maneuver in these different spaces and elements that others don't really talk about or talk to or even kind of care about, I think. And so because of those things, because I know crows to be kind of multifaceted, they have to be multifaceted in the book. And also because of blackness, the race, because black people are often seen as one thing, and I know that we're not, I also had to mimic that within the book as well. And so crows being multifaceted has to mimic how blackness is multifaceted and expansive.
Thank you. Well, let's take a little break and come back and do the second segment. So for the second segment, I always invite the guests to bring a topic of their own, which can be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Yes. So there's also a reason why I read The Fever, because this topic I want to talk about is about sex scenes and everything. And only because my boyfriend and I was recently watching The Handmaid's Tale, a recent new episode, maybe like last week. And there was a sex scene that just didn't make sense to me. And I was like, why do a lot of primarily straight filmmakers, TV shows, whatever, have these weird sex scenes where they have to like, one have a very, very like vivid or very, very uncomfortable sex scene paired with a very like uncomfortable, like either death or some weird other scene. And it's like, well, I don't understand. I never understood why media or TV shows and movies portray sex in a way that's so over dramatized and not solely based off of the art of sex. And it's also that because of thinking of other books or other forms of media, even my own book, and thinking about how I write sex. So thinking of like what makes everyone feel sex has to be either over dramatized or so secretive and not spoken. And for me, it's weird given that my book deals with a lot of sex very openly. And so for me, it's just like why is that? And I never understood how to approach that conversation.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing because, it's something that we all kind of know that like sex in the media very rarely resembles what sex is actually like between people.
Right.
I remember this was years ago at this point, hearing Linda Holmes on Pop Culture Happy Hour talking about, I think she was talking about the show You're the Worst. And she was saying that there was something that was interesting because at the time the show was pretty new, but how the sex in that show like actually felt more like people actually having sex than so many other depictions of it. And I feel like at this point we're so used to sex being over dramatized or, set to music, but like not really, how like in real life sex can be funny. It can be sometimes maybe you would like start talking to each other in the middle of it, right. But I feel like as uncomfortable as we culturally are with the idea of sex, showing that kind of sex scene would probably make people even more uncomfortable,
I think you're right. I think you're right. I think portraying sex in the very real way that it happens on screen or in media, I think won't go over well. I think people will then be like, this isn't realistic. And it's like, no, that's probably the most realistic we've ever seen because that's kind of how sex happens. It's not just like weird passion thing or like music and flourishes. Like sometimes it is like a funny moment happening while it's happening and they laugh, right? This is also why I think it's just kind of moving a little away from the conversation, but kind of related. This is also why I love sitcoms because I think sitcoms portray sex in the most real way possible, but from the view of it supposedly being funny or humorous.
This is just partly, I think, how narrative writing works, but just that it's hard to have something as sort of physically or emotionally intense as sex can be appear in especially narrative fiction like you would see in a sitcom or a TV drama or a novel or whatever, and just have it be a thing that happens. Like it has to mean something, right? Like it has to, the sex isn't, like when you're talking about, I don't watch The Handmaid's Tale just because I don't get that channel, but when you're talking about how often sex scenes will be like sort of uncomfortable and weird, but also intercut with scenes of other stuff happening, right? The sex it's not really sex as sex, but it's like sex as symbol, right?
Yeah.
And I think there's something that can, like symbols have their utility, but also there is, I don't know, like you're always told when you're, in writing, like if it doesn't need to be in there, then like take it out, right? Like it just, everything in there has to be doing something, right? But like, I think that maybe what like our vocabulary of what sex can do or mean or symbolize or all of these things is sort of stunted,
Yeah, I agree. I think you're right. I think everyone who writes about sex, I say everyone very broadly, obviously, but like the idea is that, like it has to mean something. Otherwise, why is it in there? And it's like, why can't it just be in there just to be in there for the sake of sex, or for the sake of the moment? And I think that goes back to the idea of like people thinking like sex has to mean something, right? Which is why it's so sacred. And so unless it's happening for the greatest of something, don't do it. Unless you're ready to do it, don't do it, right? And so it's a weird thing, I think, particularly for me, because again, my book has so many sex scenes, and I'm thinking particularly of Thine Will Be Done, which is a masturbation scene. And while I think the poem does something, right? The poem does do something about reclamation and power and self-worth and yada, 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 all the stuff you can look into if you're like analyzing the poem. As the poet, as a writer, it's just a scene of masturbation. Like, there's more to it, of course, but that's pretty much it. And so why, again, I'm reaching, of course, but I think if more places like media, if more media, movies, TV shows, whatever, just use sex just to have it, and not for it to mean something, I wonder how that would shift how people would then see themselves in relation to, say, a sex scene, or in relation to sex in general, or even to their bodies.
I mean, I think, when I'm thinking about the poems in your book, in any poem, like a successful poem, like there's always the thing that's happening, and then there's like layers of meaning, right? And like you say, that poem is exploring a lot of different ideas and using sex as sort of like a doorway, right, into discussing some of these things, or like an expression of those things. But I think that the fact that sex is so sort of ubiquitous in the collection and presented, like, it's not presented in a matter of fact way, because there is an emotional intensity to all of these poems, but it's also that, like, sex is just sort of like a part of life, right?
Right.
Like, it's not something separate from life. And maybe that has something to do with the way it's depicted in so many other media, that you have like the rest of your life and then you have your sex life. Because I think, like, it would be kind of weird writing to just have something happen for no reason and then like not bear on anything, right? But like, that's just not how we understand stories. But the way that like the sex has to be symbolic rather than expressive, does that, I'm not sure if that makes quite sense, but I feel like I'm sort of groping around trying to find exactly what I mean. You know what I'm saying?
No, yeah, I think that's really, really spot on. Like, I think a lot of times when we see sex depicted, it becomes like a separate entity. And I think why a lot of scenes are undercut with other things, because they're trying to like rope it back into like life, but it comes off as more symbolic than it is expressive. I'm thinking of, there's a book I love by Brandon Taylor, his first novel, Real Life. I love it.
I love that book.
Oh my God, it's so good. I think it's one of my favorite books I've ever read, actually. But how Brandon is able to write those sex scenes, it feels like it's a part of, the main character's life, and not necessarily, of course, it does symbolize something because it's a book, right? But it doesn't feel like it's a separate entity. It feels like it's a part of the narrative, and it's necessary for the main character's kind of growth. And the episode of Handmaid's Tale that I mentioned earlier, when they were having sex, I didn't feel like it was a part of the person's life, in the sense that it felt like it had to happen for the sake of the greater story, where in real life, I didn't feel like the sex had to happen, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like it was just part of the life of the character, versus like, if they don't have sex, we can't get to this next part of the point of the plot. That's not necessarily true. For Handmaid's Tale, I feel like they had to have sex to get to the next point in the plot. It felt different. Yeah.
The way that Brandon writes sex is, it's in that novel, in his short stories. So much of what he does in his fiction is about sort of the interiority of his point of view characters. And I feel like that is something that when you have these, it's so often in like a TV show or a movie, or even in some novels, you're kind of like looking at it through soft focus, and there's like music swelling, and you're not really present in it with the characters, right? Like, you are not feeling what they feel. It's more like like maybe, I don't know, a lot of times when they do sex in Game of Thrones, it's just like, here are some boobs, like this will be tittillating for you, right?
Yes.
Here, you know, it's not really doing anything other than trying to evoke that kind of a response from the audience, but you're not really given any kind of interiority into what those characters are going through in that moment. Where like with Brandon, you never get the sense that like there's background music playing, right? It's
Right.
You are right there with the characters, and it's really arresting the way that you get to sort of, you know, even though like, and the way that he writes it is very simple and like the scenes are kind of unadorned, and that in itself feels unusual, you know?
Yeah. I totally agree. I think all of those, everything that he writes for sure feels like it's not trying to create a falsehood of the character's reality. Where I do think a lot of sex scenes or even like small intimate scenes that's depicted across media is trying to convince the audience that this is a big moment, and so they have the flourishes, they have, you know, random kind of flourish of dialogue. The scene seems to be just right, both if it's like, you know, a special moment, or even if it's like a weird, like, even the sex scene is supposed to be like gritty. Even the grittiness seems too perfect. It's like, okay, this isn't really, I don't really see this actually happening. And so the way Brandon writes, he removes the just rightness for the sake of the interiority and the moment.
Yeah. He's one of my favorite writers.
Yeah, he's phenomenal.
It's amazing. So I think we're coming up on time, but so the last question that I like to ask everyone is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
I was gonna, oh my God, I'm so mad I brought up Brandon Taylor because I was gonna bring up real life, but now I won't. So mad at myself for doing that.
It's such a good one though.
It's so good.
It's amazing.
So I guess all this is gonna flow well, I think. And so I've been reading. I was a person, so I love anime. I think that's very clear, probably to anybody following me on Twitter at this point. I really love anime. I was a person who, for those who don't know what anime is, it's just Japanese cartoons. To put it very, very plainly, most anime comes from manga, which are Japanese comics. And so for the longest time, I told myself I wasn't a person who read manga because I do so much other reading in my life that I didn't want to read manga, and like kind of conflates my, I guess, career in like a hobby. And so for the longest time, I didn't read manga. I still don't really read manga, to be honest, but over the pandemic years, I started reading. I was really desperate for kind of a boys love anime. And I binged a lot. Oh my God, I've been just too many, to be honest. But then, I've got to the point where like, okay, there's nothing new out in the world. Like, how can I still get this? And so, without reading manga, because by that time I've watched the anime and I don't read the manga. So I was like, okay, I still want to find ways to kind of fulfill this deep desperation of this material. And so I turned to manhwas, which are Korean comics. And so it's still the same thing where it's like, oh, I'm not reading manga, but now I'm reading manhwas, but just digitally. And I've been only reading boys' loved ones. And I really said because I did all that background because the boys' love manhwas are so sexual. They're literally all driven around sex. And I think the way that sex is depicted in this particular genre is so inspiring for me. Because, after a while, after a while reading the same type of things, you can for sure pick up a structure. But the structure that I love about it so much is that it follows a very unique structure that I don't see in other forms of literature or media, that it creates a world or creates an art form of sex that is both hilarious and also so deeply unrealistic. And for me, when I think about how to write sex or intimate moments, moving forward, at least, I'm finding myself thinking of how they're depicted in manhwas and how they're kind of over dramatized in a very charming way that I think then becomes almost a sort of its own reality. So when I'm thinking of poems that, for myself, writing poems that want to depict sex, I'm thinking of how can I make this so overly dramatic that it becomes the reality of the piece. Not necessarily saying I want to like have like, you know, a speaker who say, you know, gets hard just off of one touch and has to jack off in the bathroom, which is a mom I'm currently reading. I started actually this morning because I was like bored, but how can I have that same sort of intensity within the piece that it feels like this only can be real for this person?
Do you have any specific like ones that spring to mind, titles?
Yes, I do. My favorite one is called Love or Hate. And I love it so much that I actually end up buying, they actually released it in print version. And so I ended up buying the print version. After reading, I was like, this is like amazing. The literature is amazing. The character development is amazing. But Love or Hate is my favorite one. I think it's phenomenally written. If I can say a little bit about like the structure of the creation of it. It's through like an interview. And then the story is being told through the interview. And that for me was like mind blowing. I was like, oh, this is really, really cool. I never saw something like this before. And so I love it because of that. Also it has like this high emotional stakes. And also at some point it starts being about sex, which also blew my mind too. So Love or Hate is a good one. Another good one, is called My Suha, Suha. Also really good. Also has a really good, character development and dynamic between characters. If folks are looking for like really, really like smutty ones, those are both very, very smutty. Like they're very, very like sex is like big there. But for people looking for like, you know, like hot bodies and like feeling turned on, people should read, this one called Love Shuttle and BJ Alex. Both of them are very, very sexual and, you know, has a lot of nasty, gritty sex.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Same. I really enjoyed it as well. You're very, very fun to talk to and talk with.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, Luther will be reading with Lynn Melnick and Carl Phillips at Brooklyn Poets on November 4th, 2022, and there is a link to the event page in the show notes. There are also purchase links for A Shiver in the Leaves and links to the Poet Salon and to Luther's newsletter, Lou's Poetry Hour. Do check those out. And that is our show. Editing and mixing on this episode is by me, the music is by Poddington Bear, and transcription help is by Shea Aguinaldo. If you'd like to do me a huge favor and bring a smile to my day, leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser, or go big and sign up for our Patreon. You can find links for all of that, plus all of the show's contact information, transcripts, and show notes at keepthechannelopen.com. I'll be back with a new conversation next month, so do be sure to come back for that. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.